I just want to say thank you to y'all for coming out today and spending some time with us, and to thank you for your support of this wonderful creative gem that we have in our city and in our state. I want to thank Pat, Liz, Sherry, and the entire staff for all of their hard work in educational outreach and in putting on these world-class exhibitions for our community. And I'd like to thank Gerald and Mary Melberg, my dealers, for all they've done for my career and for my family. We each get two families in this life, the one that we're born into and the one that we make along the way, and they are part of that family for us. I'd also like to thank the Bellamy Law Firm for the support of this exhibition. And I'd like to say that the only reason I'm standing here today is because I had parents who let me be the most like myself. So I want to finally say thank you to them up there for that. Decades and decades ago, way back when Pluto was still a planet and HBO was simply home box office, the Danish astrophysicist Niels Bohr was allegedly asked to come out of retirement and tour America, speaking on college campuses about quantum mechanics. And at first he resisted. He was comfortable in his retirement, but they sweetened their offer. They offered him a Lincoln Town Car and his own personal driver. So he acquiesced, and off they went, and it was a triumph. Elegant lectures, followed by a Q&A, and then off to the next campus. And eventually, Niels Bohr became friendly with his driver and moved up into the front seat. And one night, on the way to the next campus, he said, "You know, you've heard me do this talk a dozen times by now, and it's basically the same talk every night. Wouldn't it be funny if we switched places? If I stood in the back of the auditorium as you, the driver, and you took the stage as me and delivered my lecture." And they tried it, and it was hilarious. Until one night, at a prominent university, a professor stood up and asked a very complex question about particle theory. And the driver on stage as Niels Bohr began to flop sweat, and the audience went, hush. Oh my goodness, she just stumped Niels Bohr. And then he walked to the front of the stage and said, "Ma'am, your question is so simple. It's so easy. I'll bet my driver could answer it." Okay. I always like that story because it reminds me that a painter must be two people inhabiting one body, a maker and a talker. Make something and tell the whole world about it. It's hip to claim that your work will speak for itself, but it won't. You have to help it. Learning to write about your work in concise language and speak about it in front of people is as important, I believe, as learning to draw and mix color, because it makes you more articulate during studio visits with dealers and collectors. It helps you to craft statements to promote your work, and most importantly, it helps you to clarify your ideas. When I start to write about my work, I always go to Penguin House. Not the publisher, but the actual Penguin House at the Central Park Zoo. I do a lot of writing in there because it's cold, wet, and it smells like penguin butt, which keeps me succinct. Shout your nutty ideas to the whole world. Society doesn't expect artists to make sound, responsible decisions. They expect us to stand naked in traffic. To be a painter, all you need is nothing, and most people don't have that. Painting is the easiest job in the world, except for the actual painting part. That takes decades and decades of practice. But everything else you need, you've probably had since the first grade. Your job is to manufacture boredom, to gain access to those things. And art is a highly evolved, highly complex form of boredom. If you're in a hurry, you're going to miss everything. Because creativity rarely comes at us from the front. It usually sneaks up on us from the sides, so you have to pay attention. Inspiration doesn't arise one sunset at a time, but by paying attention all the time. Inspiration is unreliable. The only thing an artist can rely on is a work schedule. Day after day, decade after decade, I show up in my studio and hack away at that gigantic, slow-moving iceberg that sits in the middle of my room. And every now and then, if I'm lucky, a piece breaks off and I get a painting. That is not inspiration. It's stubborn persistence. The worst thing you can do is to have a plan. The heavyweight boxer Mike Tyson said, "Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth." You will get punched in the mouth, I promise. But the artists who endure are the ones who don't know how to do anything else but show up and take the punches. The greatest blessing of my life was being born and raised here in Myrtle Beach, where the four seasons are summer, hurricane, Christmas, and azalea. I had horrible buck teeth and a mouth full of braces. I could pick up AM radio in my teeth. My nickname on the streets was Sea Monkey because I like to be in or near the water. And just the other day at LaGuardia, Katie and I were flying down here. The TSA agent looked at my license, looked up at me, and said, "Tell me your street name." I said, "Sea Monkey?" Like that. Myrtle Beach in the late 70s had very little exposure to the fine arts. The first artist I ever met was me. My art education began at Chapin Memorial Public Library in the art history section. And I can still remember it was the 700s in the Dewey Decimal System. My mom would drop me off there a couple of days a week. I would read, and then she'd pick me up, and we'd always stop at Krispy Kreme on the way home. I learned to spell Picasso in the same way I learned to spell dessert. Double S's for double helpings. When I look back all these years later on those library experiences, I realized that the greatest gift that the library gave me was the gift of misunderstanding. And what I mean is that painting is not only about what you comprehend, but what you don't understand. Whether it was Italian Futurism, Russian Constructivism, or French Impressionism, reading about stuff that I didn't really understand was a golden opportunity to waste time in dead ends, unprofitable pursuits, and false starts. And that's when I learned the miracle of play. It's very, very important that an artist never lose touch with the act of playing. I was learning how to think like a painter, and I didn't even know it. When you're starting out, don't do what you think people will like, because chances are there's already someone doing that better. Do what you think people will hate, because then you're going to be all by yourself. We never needed Guns N' Roses, because the Rolling Stones did that kind of rock and roll better. If you like Black Sabbath, then don't start a heavy metal band that wears crucifixes and patchouli. They had it covered. I never intended to make lush, buttery landscape paintings because John Constable and Joan Mitchell had that covered. I needed a place all my own, and it turns out it was in front of me all along. It was in the gumball green lights of a tilt-a-whirl against a Prussian blue Carolina sky, and the lavender neon of all-you-can-eat Calabash seafood signs 3 stories tall. But it was also in the cobalt green of palmetto frond and soft compositions of shade. I've said this to audiences literally all over the world. Myrtle Beach was the ideal place to grow up for an artist. I say that because Myrtle Beach is one place that has 2 faces. On one hand, it's a resort town with arcades and amusement parks. On the other hand, it has some of the most ravishingly beautiful landscapes on the East Coast. All I had to do as a kid was pay attention, and I was good at that, because something miraculous was happening right in front of my eyes. 2 landscapes, one natural, one artificial, were crashing into each other head-on at 250 miles an hour, so violently that they secreted a liquid that was bright and combustible. And that liquid has been the jet fuel for my paintings for 45 years. Find a place in art where you don't see what you want to see and stay there. The South Carolina coast taught me how to break down the landscape into 3 parts and then relate those parts to the solitary human figure. For instance, the foreground is visceral and immediate. It's the ground right under my sneakers. The middle ground is a little bit farther away. I could easily walk over there, but first must project myself there in my mind. The background is too far away to walk, so I can only project myself there in my imagination. So 3 layers of spatial information, foreground, middle ground, background, are compressed into a single view. The farther away it is, the more it has to become internalized, because I have to imagine being way over there while I'm standing here. Content in my paintings is a direct function of how near or far away something appears from your face. And that's why I emphasize texture and surface so much in my work. Before I even knew what an artist was, I would scoop up fistfuls of pluff mud down in Garden City in the marshes, splat it on the dock under the savage sun, and then arrange torn bits of colored construction paper across the mud. And then another palmful of mud on top of that. An oyster shell was the ideal tool for skimming off layers of that translucent slime to reveal jeweled colors of varying intensity depending on how hard or lightly I skimmed. I did it again and again and again. Everything I needed was right there at my feet. And something about those mud experiences as a kid taught me everything I needed to know about how a painting comes into being. Oil paint is crushed rock mixed with liquefied fat and smeared on cloth. Yet in the hands of an artist, it can suggest space where there was flatness and light where there was darkness. Painting is unique among all art forms. Unlike other mediums like literature or dance, theater, film, in which the artist edits and modifies before the audience ever experiences the work, a painting bears all of the tattletale evidence of its own creation. Painting is the consequence of one person's activity. We are culture's last folk artists because we make things by hand. Sometimes the art world likes to tell you that homemade thinking went out of fashion with homemade bread. But we don't deal in fashion. Chasing trends is a full-time job. The word trend comes from the word trendin, which means to revolve. The art world is obsessed with novelty, but we make paintings, not flat-screen televisions. Our job is not to dazzle critics with the latest model, but to fuse personal experience into tenable form. Whenever you hear a critic anoint the next contemporary master, run for the exits. Cultural prophecy is a fool's game. Time, not the market, determines quality. Everything under the sun has already been done, just not by you. So tell the truth from your heart. Tell it as you see it. That's what people want to see. That's what people will pay for. Painting is skill and imagination combined to make something that transcends both. Painting isn't created, it's made. All of the content sits on the tip of the brush because there isn't room there for anything else. When I fling paint at a canvas, it splats. If I add thinner, it runs. If one color appears to pass on top of another, it's because it really does. There are no tricks. What you see is what matters. Bob Dylan wrote, "To live outside the law, you must be honest." Here's some honesty for you. Whenever Katie and I have the good fortune to go to a nice restaurant in New York with our friends, or just together, and the waiter or waitress opens up a really beautiful bottle of wine, I always take the first sip and say to myself, is this really better than strawberry Kool-Aid? I want to also address the term abstraction, because that can be sometimes off-putting to people. Abstraction is not a style, it's a process. It's something that an artist does. To abstract means to remove, which implies that it must be removed from something tangible, something recognizable, or something that the artist knows in the real world. So there is no such thing as an abstract painting. There are only images that have been abstracted by an artist. So I don't look for compositions in nature, I make compositions from nature. So if you stand in front of one of my paintings and you think you might see a tree trunk, or a clam bed, or crumbs of sunlight peeking between branches, or you just feel the thickness of a steamy Carolina morning, you're right. Trust your sensitivity. What you see is all that matters. The painter Charles Hawthorne wrote that painting is like making an after-dinner speech. If you want to be remembered, say one thing and sit down. I say one thing. Every painting I make begins and ends with one image, a tree trunk and its shadow. And you can see some of those drawings in the adjacent room over here. A tree trunk and its shadow say, this is here. By paying attention and drawing them with pencil and paper, I can respond, I am here. As I walk around the tree, that which had been hidden from view slowly reveals itself. And like any journey, as soon as you've taken your first step, you've abandoned your starting point. Travel eliminates its origins. As the novelist Gertrude Stein wrote, whenever you get there, there is no there. Human beings make art so that we have an excuse to stare at each other. Peering into someone else's heart grants us a stronger purchase on our own. Art is empathy, and it will save the world. Painting is the most empathetic art form because when you stand in front of a painting, you're about 24 inches away from the surface. You are standing in the exact same spot that the painter did as he or she applied each delicate skin of color over time. So if I'm in the Met looking at a late Rembrandt self-portrait, I'm standing exactly where he stood in 1668 and he made the painting. So in that moment, two people share one set of footprints, the maker, him, the taker, me. And together we manufacture a place that has never existed before in the universe, nor will ever exist again. And I think that's a really beautiful way to live. I'm always a little embarrassed when looking at a painting because the feelings that I thought were my own were really those of someone else. I recognize them. And that's what great art does. It makes us recognize what we've never seen before. There's nothing more disappointing than a painting that tries to provoke a certain point of view. Painting depends more on your mental point of view than your moral point of view. As my old teacher, the late William Halsey from the College of Charleston used to tell me, an eye not told what to see, sees more. Painting is intellectual, but it's important to remember that every thought begins as a feeling. So feel first. If we're always seeking meaning, then we run the risk of overlooking reverie. Pleasure is itself a form of knowledge. The poet Mary Oliver wrote a poem about a grasshopper. Charles Schulz wrote a comic strip about a dog. The Beatles wrote a song about a yellow submarine. And Vincent van Gogh painted a pair of shoes. What all of those great artists have in common is that they were not trying to outsmart everyone else in the room, nor were they trying to challenge us to figure out what it means. They were simply saying, hey, come over here. I have something to show you. Art must point someplace. On my studio wall hangs a 1964 black and white photograph of Paul McCartney and John Lennon singing on stage, beaming with joy. And I love that photograph because of their smiles. Not the smiles of a couple of rock stars thinking, look at us playing for 10,000 screaming fans, but just a couple of guys thinking, I can't believe we get to do this for a living. And that's what I utter to myself as I cross the threshold into my studio every day. I can't believe I get to do this for a living. And then I get to work because I have something to show you. Thank you. And I think Pat allowed us a few minutes, if there's any questions or comments at all. Technical, they can be anything at all. Sherry, do we have time?
You have 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes?
5 minutes,
Okay.
and then
Okay.
the book signing.
Okay, just give me the hook when it's, yeah. Okay. If there's any questions, technical things, I know there's a lot of painters here. Anything? Yeah, yes.
Have you always painted in this style? How long did it take you to develop a style, I guess?
The appearance of the work now took about, I've been painting for 45 years. The work I did as a kid was both representational, and then I sort of riffed on more abstracted things, putting dynamic shapes and colors together on the back porch of my parents' house in these sort of three-dimensional constructions. Then at College of Charleston, that's really where I found my people, and that's where I was given total carte blanche to mess up and to do. The answer to every question was yes in Charleston. So that's where I went from more of almost a pop art kind of aesthetic into something a bit more local. And by local, I mean the light and geography of the region that I know the best, the place I learned how to see, right here. And when I moved to New York, because I was so far away from that landscape, it made it more intense and more saturated, as if you were to compress it down to like the size of a diamond. And that little diamond has been the well that I've dipped into for 35 years. I've lived up there. So the style that I do now is basically a continuation of the last like 35 years. It changes a little bit, but I consider myself very lucky that I have that same well that I can dip back into. It's very important for a painter to have limited perspectives. Any artist, I think. If you try to do too many things, you're not going to do any of them really well. So I figure if I do one thing and go to one place, I can sustain an entire career, and it's worked.
Not a painter, my wife's the painter. Having put 2 kids through CFC, then law school and medical school in Charleston, I think I know what they got out of all that time. What did you specifically get out of that very historic, sort of beautiful place called Charleston?
Yeah, that's the first time I've ever been asked that, actually. What I got out of being in Charleston, it was the feeling of history, and then the feeling of being immersed in this very ancient landscape with the rivers and the marshes and the oyster beds and all that, but also all of the international voices that any great city is privy to. My teacher was from Wales and knew everybody, Hockney and Francis Bacon. William Halsey, of course, the great dean of abstract painting in the South, was my teacher. And we had just people come in from all over the country. Christo, who wraps the monuments and stuff, would come, and I picked him up at the airport. And so I got to meet a lot of people, and those things were because of Charleston being such an international city. And it was small enough to manage, and it was a nice sort of jumping off point for moving to Manhattan, was Charleston. But it never got out of my system. So I consider myself very fortunate, and I really became a painter there. So I'm very heavily indebted to them. Yes?
Who is your favorite artist?
Who's my favorite artist? It has to be visual, or it could be any artist.
It could be any artist.
Glenn Gould, who was a Canadian pianist who lived from 1932 to 1982. Not necessarily for music, he was also kind of a philosopher and a writer, and I would go up to Canada twice a year in the 90s and study his work and his life. Had nothing to do with visual art, but in a weird way it had everything to do with visual art. Yes?
What do you do to replenish or restore your passion?
I try not to describe it as a passion at all. I describe it as a job. And I know I have a schedule. I show up Monday to Friday, 9:30. I have a very strict ritual. I have coffee and oatmeal with my buddies at the diner. I go to the gym for 20 minutes. I get to the studio, and I'm there till about 5:30. Weekends are for family. And if I treat it with those very strict parameters, I find that I'm very productive in those limitations. And when it's not happening, which is very often, I quit. I simply quit. And no one talks about that. We're always told to keep going and stick with it and evolve and grow. If something's too hard, quit. I go to a movie, I walk around the block, I go to Chinatown and get a back massage. I do other things. I simply quit. And when it's time to come back, you'll know it. It will tell you. But it's okay to quit. Without quitters, a stampede would never end. It takes one buffalo to say, I'm exhausted, my knees hurt, let's get a pizza, let's quit. So, yeah. So I don't think of it as passion. I think of it as a job.
Brian, do you, when you get started on artwork, on a particular painting, do you know in your brain what it's going to look like at the end, or does it just evolve as you go along?
Yeah. So when I get started, do I have a preconceived notion of what it might look like, or does it just happen the other way? And the answer is the latter. The drawings that I make, which you can see, the pencil drawings, I put a stool under a tree usually down near Charleston, Palmetto State Park, or at Work Green Gardens right here, and I draw exactly what I see. I don't make anything up. But when I paint, I allow the sensation and the feeling of having been in those places sort of come out, and it's important for me that I don't have a plan, that I just let the work tell me what to do. So in other words, the process takes over, and somehow being involved in putting paint down and scraping it off and blending it and diluting it, all of those things that I've done for so long, it's just like muscle memory, and it takes over. So the content, in a way, comes out of the process. The ideas are not first, the process is first. So I don't have a plan. And it never ends up looking like what I might have hoped. It always ends up better. So the key is to trust your gut and trust that it will tell you when to stop and when to do this and that. And most of the time it fails, and no one ever sees those.
We really need to help Brian stick to his schedule. So, Brian, thank you.
My pleasure. Okay. Thanks for coming.